No real red flags there. The first part, sure, that's fine. Well, that's not true at all. It's not just merely our claim. There's something missing here. China. My name is Levi Browdy. I'm the Executive Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center. Today, we'll walk through a New York Times article published in 2024 that attempts to explain Falun Gong and some of the organizations started by Falun Gong practitioners, such as Shen Yun Performing Arts. Hello, folks. So for about 8 or 9 months now, the New York Times has published a series of articles targeting Shen Yun Performing Arts, the classical Chinese dance company that is very popular around the world and was started by Falun Gong practitioners. Falun Gong is the Buddhist-based spiritual practice that was originally originated from China, very popular there. 100 million people were practicing by the end of 1999, and today is practiced in over 100 countries around the world. These articles seem to be scrutinizing and really going after Shen Yun. But in the midst of them, what they did for one of the articles is they took a little bit of a step back and they had one article dedicated just on Falun Gong. So today, I'm going to go through this article that's focused on Falun Gong and see how it stands up to scrutiny. Okay? So let's dive in. The title, How a Persecuted Religious Group Grew into a Global Movement. I wouldn't really call us a movement, but that title seems overall fair. Founded in China in the early 1990s, true, Falun Gong unsettled Chinese government officials and quickly became subject to brutal repression. It has prospered nonetheless. Well, no real red flags there. The story real behind that is Falun Gong became too popular. It was very much supported by the Chinese government, as it was throughout all of society throughout the 1990s. Very beloved. It was in every park in the morning. You'd see people practicing Falun Gong, but it got very, very popular. And so the top leader in the summer of 1999 ordered that the group be eradicated. There was a little bit of a power struggle there, but he prevailed. And so for the last 25 years, people who practice Falun Gong in China have been subject to an absolutely horrific, brutal persecution campaign. Overall, the subtitle seems okay. The posters are instantly recognizable, a feature on storefronts around the world whenever the Shen Yun Performing Arts show comes to town. Sure. Featuring graceful dancers in billowy costumes, the ads promise a glimpse of China before communism. Again, I'm not sure about this billowy costumes thing, but generally that sounds right. The show is one of the most visible parts of the Falun Gong spiritual movement, whose 3-decade history includes a brutal crackdown in China, claims that its members' organs were harvested, and a transnational repression campaign that continues to this day. Okay. Again, I really like the idea of spiritual movement that represents sort of a proactive goal, like a group came together and said, hey, we got to do this thing. And that's not what Falun Gong was about. It's about people meditating by themselves in the bar and together in groups in the park. It wasn't until the Chinese regime tried to torture them, throw them in prison, and kill them because of their beliefs that they stood up collectively and said, no, that's wrong. If you call that a movement, sure. The one word I have a real problem with in this article is the word claims. Claims that its members' organs were harvested. Well, that's not true at all. It's not just merely our claim. Or I should say, that is gravely misleading by omission, because the implication is that we're the only one claiming it. For years, outside experts had done research on this whole area. The former Secretary of State for Asia Pacific out of Canada, very prominent human rights attorneys and journalists around the world that are familiar with China have all studied this. They published books on it. And in 2018, Jeffrey Nice, the British attorney who put Slobodan Milosevic behind bars back in the former Yugoslavia, he chaired a year-long tribunal bringing experts from all over the world. And the conclusion of that tribunal, much like the research that had preceded it, was that Falun Gong people were being killed on a significant scale so that their organs could be harvested to fuel a multi-billion-dollar organ transplant business in China. The tribunal's own estimates said that anywhere from 60,000 or more were being killed annually for this horrific crime. This is not the claims of Falun Gong people. This is a broad spectrum of experts who understand this area and have been screaming from the rooftops for years about this terrible, terrible crime going on in China. So gravely misleading to reduce that to merely our claims. If the claims word also applies to the second part of that sentence, transnational repression campaign, again, widely documented in major human rights organization documentation, particularly Freedom House, one of the most prominent NGOs in our country, have documented the transnational repression against the Falun Gong diaspora around the world. I've seen it up close. I've seen Falun Gong people being beaten by pro-Beijing thugs on the streets of New York City. I've seen a Falun Gong person be shot in South Africa as he was trying to serve legal papers to a traveling Chinese delegation to sue them for crimes against humanity, human rights violations. I've seen Falun Gong people being beaten all over this country in front of the consulate in Chicago, in San Francisco. I have seen letters from Chinese diplomats putting pressure on, using thuggery tactics on anywhere from congressmen to senators, and members of Congress, town mayors, theaters that want to host Shen Yun. The transnational repression is widely documented and abundantly available. So this claims word on organ harvesting and transnational repression is gravely misleading. Okay. Continuing. On Friday, the New York Times reported that Shen Yun's young performers have been regularly subjected to emotional abuse and manipulation. Okay, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I have two adult sons that perform with Shen Yun. They have for many years. Before that, they went through two schools that share the campus with Shen Yun's headquarters, where a lot of the Shen Yun performers are trained. What the New York Times saying is not our experience, the experience of my son, their friends, all the people I know there. It is a world I don't recognize at all. And in fact, a petition of over 1,500 current performers, former performers, and immediate family members have said the same thing, calling the New York Times reporting on this a gross distortion of the way we live, what we believe. I did a whole video on that to sort of dissect the latest edition of the New York Times article. I'll put that in the comments below. You can take a look at that and addresses that issue. Okay. Since its introduction in China about 30 years ago, Falun Gong has gained a global following comprising Chinese immigrants and non-Chinese practitioners alike. They have extolled the health benefits of its meditative exercises. Okay. The first part, sure, that's fine. I mean, again, following, I think one thing to understand about Falun Gong is it doesn't have any of the structures you have in most religions or even, organized spiritual practices. There's no membership. There's no membership fee. There's no sort of like places of worship. There's no clergy and things like that, generally speaking. And so if you want to practice Falun Gong, organizationally, it's just like, doing yoga. You can download the books for free on the internet. You can learn the meditation practice for videos free on the internet and do it in your living room without ever talking or contacting anybody. Following, but sure. I mean, I understand where they went that. The main problem there is that last sentence. They extolled the health benefits of meditative exercises. Again, like the claims word, like we're the only ones saying it. Now, first of all, let's talk about volume. There are literally, thousands, probably at this point, tens of thousands testaments to people practicing Falun Gong all over the world, primarily in China, talking about the amazing health benefits that they have experienced. And in fact, if you go back to look at China's state-run media by the government back in the 90s, when Falun Gong was beloved and it was very popular and it was growing fast, the state-run media itself talks about the amazing health benefits of Falun Gong and how wonderful it is for the health and longevity and all kinds of things like that. There have been studies inside China, many studies outside China, many studies by medical professionals measuring the effectiveness of Falun Gong on people's health. This is not something we just extol. The evidence is in abundance and it's everywhere on just how effective Falun Gong is for health, physical health, mental health, spiritual health. So again, this is sort of this whole reductionist thing, like everything that could be positive about Falun Gong is is put in this little box of we're the only ones saying it. And it's just not true. So I find that very misleading. Okay. Moving on. Precise estimates of the number of Falun Gong followers are difficult to obtain because the movement says it has no formal membership system. Not really. It's not just we say, it actually has no formal membership system. I'm sure as investigative reporters, if it did, they would have uncovered that. So again, minimalizing everything to just stuff we're claiming or saying. It has no formal membership. That is indeed why it's impossible to give you estimates around the world. Now, again, the estimates I gave you, that was a survey done by the Chinese government itself. And you have to talk to them about how they came up to those numbers, but I know people felt those to be fairly accurate. But nowadays, yeah, there is no precise way to do that. Okay, moving on. Falun Gong's press department says it has followers in more than 100 countries. That's true. I just said that a little bit before. Including about 10,000 who live in the United States. Okay, that, I don't think we've said that. Because again, how would we know? Here's what we do know. What are the data points we have? Occasionally, Falun Gong practitioners will have something called an experience sharing conference, where they just come together and people read papers about what their experience was of the practice. You know, it's a spiritual practice where you're trying to become a better person according to Falun Gong's principles, which are truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. Now, try being that in every moment of your life as you go through the day. It's kind of hard. So sometimes it's helpful to hear how people, deal with certain situations. Someone gets in your face and starts, really yelling at you, or you go through a different trauma in your life. How did you apply these principles, truthfulness, compassion, forbearance in your life? And so we'll come together and have an experience sharing conference, and sometimes they're fairly large. A few years ago, we had a conference in the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, and that was well over 10,000 people. And so if you look at some of the events, you can see the volumes of people that are going to these conferences. And so from there, you could sort of ascertain if that's many people are going to the conferences, there's probably a lot more around the country. So that's really all we can say. Again, there's no membership, there's no rosters, so it's really impossible to put exact numbers on it. But you can sort of glean some information from these events, and that's where that number comes from. I don't know if we might have, but I don't know if we've ever put that number in the United States. Here's what to know about the movement, its persecution in China, and how it all connects to Shen Yun. All right, pretty big promise that the article is going to deliver that, but let's take a look. How did Falun Gong begin? Okay, in 1992, a former grain clerk named Li Hongzhi began delivering lectures across China to introduce a new spiritual discipline called Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa. All right, well, all that's true, but this whole term, former grain clerk, guess where that comes from? Chinese Communist regime propaganda. When they started going, they never called him that really until after 1999, when they wanted to persecute the group and they wanted to demonize it and vilify it. And of course, they're trying to belittle his credentials and say, how could a former grain clerk start a spiritual practice? When in fact, if you look at the founder of Falun Gong's background, he's been doing spiritual practices since he was, like 4 years old. He's well versed in this kind of thing. And so to reduce his background or try and sort of classify him as a former grain clerk is that's like calling Einstein a former patent clerk. I mean, it's true. He worked there for a day, but I think he did some other things. And I think he had a background that led him to do those other things. That's what they're doing here. And the fact that they'd parrot Beijing's sort of take on these things so readily, red flag. Anytime you are doing and saying the exact same thing the most evil communist regime on earth is doing, I would hope there'd be some soul searching. But anyway, let me move on. At the time, ancient energy-based exercises known as Qigong were surging in popularity, part of a revival of religious life after the death in 1976 of Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader who had tried to stamp out traditional culture. All right, this is basically true. There was a real Qigong boom. Qigong is sort of often called Chinese yoga, and particularly in the 80s and into the early 90s, there was a real popularity in these Qigongs. However, it was sort of a watered-down version. Qigong practices, if you look through China's history, going back thousands of years, have always been there, but they've always been very spiritual in nature. And I think what you saw in the 1980s was some just sort of like the physical manifestations. And you'd see people in parks all over the country doing the exercises, but it's sort of been the moral side and the religious or spiritual side was not really present in a lot of those. And that's where, when Falun Gong came on the scene in 1992, it was quite different. Anyway. Mr. Lee prescribed a set of exercises that included slow movements of the hands and arms meant to circulate energy around the body, generally true. Falun Gong believers practice by doing the exercises in public parks, meditating, and reading Mr. Lee's text known as Fa study. Generally true. There are groups in parks, and it was very popular again, especially in China, but also around the world, where people would get together in parks. But also a lot of people just practice in their home. Again, as I said, there's no memberships, there's no rosters. They just sort of throw out this Fa study thing. I'm like, why not translate that so you understand what that means? You just throw in this foreign word. So Falun Dafa, literally translated, Falun Dafa, let me explain that. So Falun Dafa is the formal name for the Falun Gong spiritual practice. Falun Gong is more, it's like its colloquial name, but it really means the same thing. It's referring to the same spiritual practice. And so Fa study is sort of a shorthand for saying studying the teachings of Falun Dafa. And they pull out the one word, and it's sort of a colloquial way to say that. Why would you just throw a foreign word at your reader and not explain it or do anything? So anyway, in interviews, current and former Falun Gong practitioners said Mr. Lee gave their lives a sense of purpose, offering a roadmap to becoming a more moral person. Many say their illnesses were healed after they began practicing. Okay, all that's true, but again, very minimalized, because you're just sort of saying, oh, this is what these people say, when I think there is an abundance of material out there, again, ironically and tragically, also including the Chinese government, that will say the same thing about this, before the persecution. If you go back to the 1990s and you look at, the state-run TV and some of the news reports and all kinds of studies that were done, they were saying the same thing. So it really wasn't just Falun Gong practitioners saying this. Starting around 1995, Mr. Lee took his lectures overseas to cities like Sydney, Australia, and Paris, building a global base of followers. Within a few years, he was directing the movement from his new home in New York, where he had settled with his family. Here's what I think is going on. I'm going to put forth a hypothesis. I think it's very difficult, if your whole worldview is very secular, to look at a religious or spiritual group and make sense of what you're looking at. And you will look at it through your own lens. And, and that's not just true of secular versus non-secular. I think it's true of sort of any kind of your own experience and how you look at the world. The way we experience it, the way Mr. Lee talked about it, is not going out to build a base. This is not a strategic move. Falun Gong has been transformative to making people healthier and happier, improving their lives, improving the relationships with their family, their communities. And he is sharing that with the world for people to do what they will with it. And maybe if you're coming from a very, again, hypothesis, if you're coming from a very secular point of view, you'd sort of look and see, oh, this looks like building a global base thing. It's not what it is. You're just wrong in terms of what we actually believe, what Mr. Lee was trying to do. It's just, we don't think that way. We're not operating that way. He's sharing a spiritual practice for free with the world. And to call that building a base of followers is misleading. Anyway, yeah, I think he did settle in New York. I don't know exactly where he lives, but I'll assume that's true. What is Falun Gong's belief system? All right. The core tenets of Falun Gong are truth, compassion, and tolerance. True. The practice, which Mr. Lee explains in his primary text, Zhuang Falun, incorporates aspects of Buddhism. Kind of true. Let's let that go for now. We might revisit it later. He teaches followers to eliminate their attachments and to look inward instead of blaming others. Generally true. The goal of the practice is enlightenment. That's true of any tradition that comes out of the Buddhist school of teachings, and Falun Gong is one of them. It is considered in the sort of the pantheon of what we'd call Buddhist school or Buddhist teachings. They all have the goal of enlightenment. In fact, I think it goes beyond Buddhism. I think you could say the same for Taoism and other things. But what about before then? The practice has a lot of intermediate things that really draw people. Again, the good health, being able to shed or let go of negative or self-destructive tendencies that hurt yourself, hurt your relationships, pride, ego, jealousy, things like this. Just let that stuff go. Let that stuff go, man. And you'll leave a happier life. The people around you will lead a happier life. So there's all these other kind of intermediate goals, maybe. But yeah, generally right. Many Falun Gong practitioners try to avoid medical treatment when they are sick. Mr. Lee teaches that negative karma causes illnesses and that it can be eliminated by enduring hardship and committing to his cultivation method. True believers in his teachings can expel illness from their bodies without medical treatment, he says. Okay. I would grade this paragraph as significantly misleading. And this is a much larger topic. I did address it in another video where I went through the latest New York Times articles by these same authors, I think, going after Shen Yun and sort of dissect this. And I talked about this a little bit, but I'll cover a little bit here. And a couple of points here. First of all, if you look at not just Falun Gong, but you look at Buddhist traditions around the world, there is a recognition of some basic principles, the idea of reincarnation, the idea of good karma and bad karma. And when you do something good, it comes back to you. Do something bad, it comes back to you. When you're experiencing bad karma, that could be a number of different ways of suffering. It could be hardships in your life. It could be losing someone you love. It could be illness. And this is something that, again, that's not specific to Falun Gong. This is in a lot of Buddhist traditions. And in the Buddhist tradition, part of the purpose of life as you go through incarnation, as I understand it, part of it is to paying back some of this karma, to getting rid of this negative karma. And indeed, so that's part of the teachings. Now, where they are, I think, very misleading is that they say because Mr. Lee teaches about the origins of illness, that therefore that automatically translates into a forbidding people to go seek medical treatment if they really are sick or they just want to feel better, to go to the hospital or go to a doctor. And that's categorically false. In my last video, I actually brought up segments of Zhuang Falun, the main book of Falun Gong, where he's clearly talking about, if hospitals can treat sicknesses, sure. Well, if they didn't treat sicknesses, why would people go there? Something to that effect. And so I think it's very misleading to conflate a understanding of the origin of suffering, including illnesses and other things, with a prescription for how you should deal with it. And that's the problem with this paragraph. Mr. Lee's teachings, a lot of teachings of Falun Gong, and again, a lot of teachings in Buddhism talk largely about the former. They don't really talk about the latter. And again, anyway, let me leave it at that. I think if you want to learn more about this, you can go look at the other video I did on the more recent article. I'll put in the comments below. Okay, Mr. Lee's teachings also contain mystical elements, as do any religion anywhere in the world, but okay. He says advanced practitioners can develop supernatural powers like the ability to levitate and see through walls. Okay, so does pretty much any Eastern religious tradition throughout all of human history. When it comes to levitation, seeing through walls. Okay, look, I've been practicing Falun Gong for more than 25 years now. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with anybody about, hey, are you learning to levitate or see through walls? It's not something we worry about. It's not something we pay attention to. Yes, there have been supernatural powers documented in mystics and religious believers throughout history, particularly in the Far East. So that's nothing new. But I think they're trying to pull that aspect out and make us sound kooky, like we walk around trying to levitate and see through walls. We don't. I don't spend any time on it. I don't think about it. So anyway, in the past 2 decades, Mr. Lee's teachings have taken on an apocalyptic tone. He has frequently talked about how practicing Falun Gong can save people from destruction during the end times. Okay, false and misleading. Apocalyptic tone. He's talked about, again, as many religions do, cycles of the universe, cycles of the earth. That's in pretty much every tradition you can look at. He has explicitly talked about not getting into apocalyptic sort of tone and not emphasizing that stuff and leading a responsible life. And, I have a 401k, I have a college fund for my kids. So the idea that, again, sort of conflating, touching upon sort of different spiritual themes and automatically assuming it dictates some strange or unhealthy behavior in real life is the fundamental problem with how these reporters and reporters like them are covering Falun Gong. Has he touched upon these topics? Sure. Does it impact our life in any unhealthy way or a way that is destructive to our families or society? No. And so it's taking these little bits and pieces of religious teachings that clearly they didn't understand and try and put in front and center and turn them into something that they're not. And yeah. In terms of the end of times, again, in the Indian tradition, they talk about the Kali Yuga. This is a very common, the Hopi calendar, the Aztecs, the Mayans, everybody talks about the cycles of Earth. And, if you look at good karma and bad karma, and you look at the world today, it's reasonable to assume, gosh, there must be a lot of bad karma because everybody seems to be fighting and angry at each other. Certainly. But what is really meant by that? Here's what they don't get into. What is really meant by saving people from destruction? As I understand it, it means helping people return to common sense, universal, wholesome values. Be more compassionate in your life. Be honest. Be resilient or tolerant of others. These are the things it's teaching. And if you adopt these principles in your life, you can transcend difficulties and elevate yourself. Or maybe they wish it was more sort of salacious or doomsday than that, but that's what it's really about. So anyway, let's move on. How does the Chinese government view the movement? Okay. Interesting. They're going to start in 1999. All right, let's see what they say. In April 1999, more than 10,000 Falun Gong followers held a peaceful rally in front of the Communist Party leadership's walled compound in Beijing. Falun Gong's ability to mobilize its followers deeply unsettled China's rulers who were wary of any organization they could not control. Okay, very interesting that they start the whole narrative of how the Chinese government view the movement in 1999. They completely eliminate the 1990s. Why do they do that? Throughout the 1990s, again, Falun Gong immensely popular in every tiny village, town, big city in China, praised in the state-run media. I have a friend who learned Falun Gong in the embassy in Paris. So the Chinese government was supporting this. Mr. Li, the founder of Falun Gong, gave lectures in places like for the Public Security Bureau to help them and heal their ailments, and all sort of, fighting a life of crime can leave with some bumps and bruises. And he gave a lecture and helped all them, and they gave him a big, thank you award and all that. So it was very beloved in China. Why would you cut all that out? No mention of that at all. We're going to start the timeline in 1999. I think is a grave disservice to your readers if you really want them to understand how the government viewed Falun Gong from the beginning and the evolution, because of course the natural question would be, well, why did it change? They start just at the changing point. So I think that's very misleading. Now, in terms of the characterization of this, on the surface, this is right. But when we say Falun Gong followers held a peaceful rally, what actually happened is that a small group of Falun Gong practitioners in a nearby city, Tianjin, were demonstrating in front of a local magazine that had written this horrible article about them, and they were all beaten up, and some of them were taken away to detention. And so other Falun Gong practitioners went to the police there and said, hey, what's going on? Why are you doing this to us? And they said, no, you got to go to Beijing. And so the Chinese government officials were telling Falun Gong, who were concerned about this, go to Beijing. Y'all got to go to Beijing and go to the appeals office, which is near the leadership compound, or like one side of it. And so that's where they all went, because they were directed to. And when they got there, they couldn't go into the appeals office. They were told to line up all around the compound. Very different story. They were directed there. They were just seeking a peaceful resolution to people being beat up. It wasn't some massive protest that they organized and they're sitting there with their pitchforks and their their torches surrounding the walled compound, but you wouldn't understand that if you just read this. And I think that's an important detail. Okay. After the rally, the authorities banned Falun Gong and issued an arrest warrant for Mr. Lee, who had already moved to the United States. The group was declared an evil cult on the front pages of party newspapers. The movement has vehemently denied being a cult. Okay, here's where it would have been nice if you told us, what did the Chinese government, if they're now calling Falun Gong an evil cult on the front of every major newspaper, were they always calling it that? Did they say anything else? Was there any kind of other documentation? Yes, there was. Go back to 1992, 93, 94, and you'll see the story was very, very different. This beloved spiritual practice was suddenly an evil cult, now that Beijing wanted to stamp it out. And I think that, too, would be informative to your reader. Okay. The movement has vehemently denied being a cult. Let's talk about this last sentence. Again, they're taking a subject and saying, oh, this is just what they claim. There are experts out there, people who've actually studied Falun Gong, who clearly look at this and say, this has no traits of a cult. This whole thing is a red herring. We actually have a whole page on our website, the Falun Dafa Information Center, that breaks this down and shows you the experts who actually know what they're talking about and know what Falun Gong is and know Falun Gong's history and have studied the community, saying not only is it not a cult, but why it's not a cult and why the regime put this label upon them. None of this is conveyed to the reader. You just hear, oh, the movement denies it. Really? That's the whole story. Thousands of Falun Gong practitioners were sentenced to prison or labor camps, according to a human rights report. People were beaten in detention facilities until they renounced their belief, and many died in police custody. Generally true in the very beginning. That's how it was. In fact, in July 20, early morning hours, people were literally pulled from their beds in the middle of the night. Around the country, people were rounded up. There were so many Falun Gong people they were trying to pull into custody that they didn't have a place to put them, and they started filling up stadiums. There are photos of stadiums in China in the summer of 1999 filled with Falun Gong people, just because they didn't have the space to detain all the people that they're trying to detain. Chinese officials have denied that Falun Gong adherents were tortured. In a statement... Oh, that's it? Okay, all right, so now we're going to go to the Chinese regime and say, oh, they denied any torture. Okay, again, this persecution has been going on for 25 years. There is an immense amount of documentation about what kind of torture, how pervasive, what's the scope of it, ranging from the UN to investigative reporters to human rights groups that have documented this stuff. And they're going to minimize that all to this one sentence, well, Chinese officials have denied it. All right. In a statement, representatives of Shen Yun and Falun Gong said that practitioners continue to die at the hands of Chinese officials. Okay, I'm sorry for sounding like a broken record here, but again, why are we the only one they're quoting on this? Would seem like a very important component to the story. Are Falun Gong people indeed being tortured and dying at the hands of Chinese officials? And the documentation on this is in abundance and readily available. So why they didn't pull that in, I don't know. Okay, Falun Gong has also said its followers were the targets of a mass program by the Chinese government to harvest their organs while they were in prison. Okay, you know what I'm going to say, right? The China Tribunal, all these sources, abundantly clear, it's all out there, and yet they want to say we're the only ones, or imply we're the only ones saying that this is happening. Chinese officials have acknowledged that organs of executed prisoners were a primary source for transplant surgeries in Chinese hospitals, but denied the allegations of harvesting organs from Falun Gong practitioners or any other detainees. Okay, let me read the next paragraph and I'll respond to this. Nicholas Bequelin, a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, who has documented the use of prisoner organs, and other leading experts on human rights in China say that there is no evidence of a systematic program to execute Falun Gong practitioners for their organs. Some practitioners, like other Chinese prisoners, may have had their organs removed if they were executed or had died in prison, he said. Okay, rather than just sitting here watching me pull my hair out every time they say we claim something and don't give any further evidence, let me show you what's out there. First of all, I'll show you this International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. This is a prominent NGO that has been operating for at least probably 10 years now, probably more. Their work started really with three men, and I'll scroll down and let you see. David Kilgore, who is the former Secretary of State for Asia Pacific of Canada and also a prominent attorney. David Mattis, a renowned human rights lawyer. These two authored one of the first pieces, the reports on forced organ harvesting that really shocked the world. The man standing next to him, Ethan Gutmann, an excellent journalist and author. He was actually in Beijing when they started the persecution of Falun Gong. He's the only journalist in the world that I know of that has traveled to countries in south or southwest of China where people from China have fled and sat down and interviewed them and actually got their stories about how they had been, while in detention in China, had been pre-screened to be targeted for organ harvesting. He wrote a book, actually, and several reports on the same topic. And so the work of this organization really started with those three men. And the evidence they uncover is shocking. I'm not going to go into all of it. I'll just give you a little taste of what's available. A couple of things. First of all, they were the first ones really to discover that organs were on demand, meaning hospitals were advertising wait times of like a week or 2 weeks. The only way that is possible is if there is already a large pool of people pre-screened, ready to kill in order to extract their organs. In civilized countries, it takes 1 to 4 years, sometimes more. They actually got doctors and administrators from hospitals in China on the phone admitting that, yes, you can get an organ in just a week or two in advance, and some of them even admitted, yes, they're coming from Falun Gong practitioners. This was absolutely shocking. They also delved into the huge number of transplants, way beyond the official numbers that Beijing was providing, and they also disclosed how there is no other explanation for the source of organs. If you look at China's state-run media and what they're saying about how many executed prisoners there are, which for many years is what they were saying is the only source of organs, it's just a tiny fraction of the total number of transplant operations. So there really is no other explained source other than killing prisoners of conscience like Falun Gong, Uyghurs, and others. So these three men, this organization, really been on top of this evidence and putting it on the world stage for years. Back in 2018, maybe early parts of 2019, the China Tribunal was convened in London by an English barrister named Jeffrey Nice. He is the same man who partially is responsible for putting Slobodan Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia behind bars. He chaired a tribunal for a year. Experts flew in from all over the world for a whole year, and if you look at their judgment, what they found, and this tribunal was just looking at forced organ harvesting, what they found is, among other things, the following. Forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. Now, was that newsworthy? Well, again, this tribunal was chaired in London. The Telegraph thought it was newsworthy, and they covered the story. The Guardian covered the story. Forbes magazine covered the story. The Hill, prominent sort of policy publication here in Washington, D.C. Reuters covered the story. Sydney Morning Herald. Who do you not see? The New York Times. Just 2 weeks ago, right here in the United States, the U.S. House passed unanimously the Falun Gong Protection Act. This was bipartisan bill supported, co-sponsored, and by both Democrats and Republicans. And what this bill does primarily is look at the forced organ harvest atrocities targeting Falun Gong and strengthen our ability to sanction it, strengthen our ability to hold industry accountable, to not be complicit in that, and strengthen our ability to bring more transparency to the forced organ harvesting atrocity. Just 2 days later, the United States Congress, the House again, passed the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act, which looks at forced organ harvesting really worldwide. There's still a little bit of a focus on China, but it's worldwide. There are 5 states in the United States that already have bills on their books, laws in place that help curtail, rein in, and at least not be complicit in forced organ harvesting in China. There are countries around the world, the UK, Israel, others, that have already passed laws similar to the one that was just passed by our House, trying to stop this atrocity, trying to make sure their own institutions, medical insurance, and so forth, are not complicit in this. This is just part of the evidence that is out there. Laws in place all around the world, prominent NGOs and lawyers and human rights workers all saying that forced organ harvesting is happening, it's happening on a significant scale, and it has not stopped. And yet, if you look at the New York Times, they will have you believe that as a reader, all you need to know about forced organ harvesting is that Falun Gong claims it was happening, the Chinese government denied it, and there is one individual they found with one China institute somewhere in the U.S. that said maybe it's not happening. That's it. Clearly, that is an enormous disservice to the readers of the New York Times. They're being completely misled on the reality of this atrocity, the scope of it, and the fact that it is ongoing. And I find that atrocious. China banned the practice of harvesting organs from executed prisoners without their prior consent in 2015. Interesting what they don't tell you. And that is, there was a former New York Times reporter who testified before the China Tribunal in London that I referenced earlier. And you can read her testimony online. It's written down. You can go find it. I'll include a link below, where she effectively said, 1, forced organ harvesting is an open secret in China. 2, when she tried to pursue the story, her editors at the New York Times effectively squashed it. Do with that what you will. Okay. How does the persecution relate to Shen Yun? In 2006, Mr. Lee helped create Shen Yun, in part to educate a wider audience about the persecution. In part, yeah, that's fair. He and his lieutenants, okay, this is not a military, there are no lieutenants. Word choice here, I think, is very deliberate. He and his lieutenants oversee the group, and many practitioners see it as a sacred honor for their children to be selected as performers. Shen Yun says its mission is to revive the traditional culture that has been destroyed after the communist takeover in China. Okay, this is problematic in that how to explain this? It is common in the Falun Gong community to believe that the Chinese Communist Party is not just an evil party doing awful things to dissidents, whoever they're persecuting. We do believe it represents a grave evil in the world. And one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that the Shen Yun performance does is make that very clear. It is, in some ways, a spiritual endeavor for the performers at Shen Yun, or really for any of the Falun Gong practitioners that may not be performers with Shen Yun, but maybe they're on the street handing out flyers to people about what's happening to Falun Gong and the evils of the CCP. Again, we feel that the CCP is a grave evil in the world. And so to some extent, it's a sacred honor. I don't know about that, but it is something that we feel deeply about, we are driven to do, and we feel it is a great service to the world to kind of pull back the veil in the CCP. Because look, Falun Gong, Uyghurs, Tibetans are not their only victims. Everything that the CCP touches seems to go bad. People, organizations, systems, and procedures. We're all suffering to some extent from the evil of the Chinese regime, whether it's the crap that goes through your news feed or the toxins that are in products, to everything they're doing to persecute Falun Gong and other groups. And so, yeah, it's on some levels we feel a bit of a spiritual battle to expose this regime. Is that so bad? I don't know. During the 2-hour show, some of Shen Yun's dance pieces show Falun Gong practitioners being beaten by dancers dressed as Chinese state police or having their bloody organs placed in a box. Since the persecution began, attacking the Chinese government. Okay, well, let me pause there. That is kind of true. Again, the show is really a journey across Chinese civilization, showing different dynasties, different religions, Buddhism, Taoism, great works of literature. And yeah, there are pieces about Falun Gong, modern China, and showing what's going on there, the heroism of the Falun Gong practitioners. So that's kind of true. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Since the persecution began, attacking the Chinese government has been a dominant theme in Mr. Li's writings. He has told his followers that it is their responsibility to clarify the truth about the Chinese Communist Party, including by urging people to see a Shen Yun show. I think it's minimizing the totality and the broader message, but generally that's true. Not unlike what I just explained to you, that we do feel the CCP represents a grave evil to the world, not just to us, but to everyone. And we do feel very driven to get that word out. Yeah. Has China's targeting of Falun Gong continued? Yes. True. Last month, 2 men pleaded guilty in New York to bribing someone they believe to be an IRS agent as part of a plot to target Falun Gong practitioners in the United States. They admitted to acting as illegal Chinese government agents. Their goal, according to federal prosecutors in Manhattan, was to revoke the tax-exempt status of an entity run by Falun Gong practitioners. Okay, all that's true. What they're not telling you is that entity is Shen Yun. And that's made very clear if you go past the initial indictment. If you look at some of the other court filings, eventually that becomes very, very, very evident. So I'm not sure why they didn't mention that, but let's see. The 2 men had also surveilled Falun Gong followers at the group's headquarters in Orange County, New York, according to an FBI interview cited in a court document. Okay. That is true. There is a court document, specifically a letter from one of the prosecutors where, I guess under deposition, I'm not sure how they got this information, but one of these guys did admit that that's what they were doing. Now, the group's headquarters, I mean, this is what Beijing calls us. This is what Beijing calls Shen Yun's headquarters. They call it Falun Gong headquarters. So it's interesting they're using that same term. They're referring to Dragon Springs, a 400-acre campus in Orange County, New York, that has traditional Buddhist-style temples, beautiful grounds. It has Fei Tian Academy and Fei Tian College, which are 2 New York registered schools where a lot of the Shen Yun artists are trained, but they also receive their education, and it's the headquarters of Shen Yun. This is all in one campus. Beijing calls it Falun Gong's headquarters. A little strange, the New York Times is picking up their lingo, but there you have it. In another recent case, federal prosecutors in Florida accused a man of providing information about Falun Gong members to a Chinese intelligence officer. True. Chinese government employees have also previously tried to stop Shen Yun performers. Yeah, that's a little bit minimized. I mean, we're talking about the ambassadors, sometimes the consul generals in countries, more than 40 countries around the world, have been engaged in this activity. It's very systematic, and they're not just employees. I mean, these are high-level diplomats. But, okay. A few years after Shen Yun began coming to the Peabody Opera House in St. Louis, now called the Stifel Theater, a Chinese consular official from Chicago visited to urge the venue not to let the group perform there, according to its booking director, Darren Hall. I'm sure that's true. That happens all over the world all the time. In an interview, Mr. Hall said the consular official offered no reason except that Falun Gong members chant outside buildings and sometimes shut down roads in China. Mr. Hall declined the request. Okay, so you get that, right? The Chinese ambassador is sort of trying to bully this theater not to have Shen Yun, and his whole reason is that Falun Gong people chant outside buildings and shut down roads in China. Okay, this whole section started with the title, Has China's Targeting of Falun Gong Continued? There's something missing here. China. For the last 25 years, this persecution has raged. To this day, as I'm making this video, untold numbers of people who practice Falun Gong or even support Falun Gong are languishing in detention centers, prisons, black jails, all kinds of facilities. People are being tortured to death every single day in China. It's been going for 25 years. Why not mention that? Especially in a section where you say, has China's targeting of Falun Gong continued? And what you have is a couple of arrests and 1 or 2 incidents of transnational repression by the Chinese regime against the Falun Gong diaspora in the United States. So anyway, that's my take on that. And there, we're at the bottom of the article, and that's it. So what is this? There's a couple themes that emerge here. Optimistically, I was looking at this and saying, hey, well, you can't really tell the story of Shen Yun without understanding Falun Gong. It is Falun Gong people of faith who started Shen Yun. They did so at a time when a persecution was raging against their faith in China. They started this company so that they could showcase not only the wonders of China before communism, the authentic Chinese culture and the values that those bring to people, but it also could tell the story of what was happening in China today. And so I was hoping, if they're going to do all these stories sort of attacking Shen Yun and trying to dissect their operations, and which in my understanding the New York Times is doing, I was hoping they stopped and said, hey, let's inform the readers. What is Falun Gong really about? Let's get into this so that the readers are informed and understand it. What I see is a lot of omission and minimizing of important issues if you really want to understand, what do Falun Gong people really believe? How does that manifest in their life and in their communities and their families? What drives these people? What gets them up in the morning? They didn't include any of that, I feel, and worse, they minimize so much of this as stuff we just claim or we're the only ones saying it, when there is an abundance of information, documentation, credible third-party organization, historical record that would give you a real picture about what Falun Gong is. And so this article fails utterly to inform the reader about what Falun Gong is really about. And worse, it builds on false narratives to create a very distorted picture about what Falun Gong does. Now, why would they do that? The only thing I can observe is the more distorted and weird and cult-like Falun Gong looks in this article, the stronger it supports the inaccuracies and the bias and the failures to disclose conflict of interest that we find in the subsequent Shen Yun articles. It supports that narrative. I can't think of another reason to author a piece about Falun Gong like this. There you have it. That's my take. Thanks. See you next time.